Hello and welcome to The Sharpening. I am your host, Josh Peck. Tonight we have Mark Flynn back on again for part 2 of the series based on his book, Forbidden Secrets of the Labyrinth. Last week we dealt with part 1, had a lot of foundational stuff, and today we're going to get into get even deeper into some very interesting topics. So without further ado, I don't want to take too much time for an introduction because we dealt with all that in the first part. So I'd like to welcome back to the show Mark Flynn. Mark, how are you doing?
Good. How are you, Josh?
I'm doing fantastic. It's been a good day. Been a really good day.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah, so the last thing we were talking about was the very interesting cult of Cybele and Attis. And actually, I don't think we were talking about the cult. We were just talking about how Attis was born. And the interesting thing about Attis is that he and his mother were said to be lovers. And the thing, as well as mother-son, and thing that was interesting that I think I didn't mention about Attis was when you see any representation of him in art, in ancient art, he has the Phrygian cap, but he also has a very subtle set of bee wings.
Oh,
I don't think a
wow.
lot of
Yeah, no, you
people
didn't mention that.
notice that. So that sort of accentuates that idea of him wearing that deshret. People wouldn't call it that; they just call it a Phrygian cap because he was, of course, from that area in Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey. And so the interesting thing to talk about is that religion, that belief in Attis and Cybele, carried on from the time way back in Anatolia to the Proto-Greek civilization that lived on the western shores of that peninsula, and later into Greece, and all the way to the 1st century AD in Rome. And it's quite extraordinary what this cult did. The Emperor Claudius, I think, was the one that brought it into the ritual of Roman religion. And one of the most significant ceremonies that they do was, and this will blow a lot of people's minds and kind of put them off of bringing Christmas trees into their house.
Oh, yeah?
Unfortunately, I love Christmas and I really like Christmas trees. I think they're very nice. And anyway, the story is that I think it was March. No, this is the autumn equinox, when the sunrise and sets, the day and night are equal. That's what it means, equal. And that's on the Julian calendar. So March 22nd is the beginning of this ceremony, but March 25th was the equinox on the Julian calendar. It's on the 21st now on our modern calendar. Anyway, what they would do is the priests of Cybele and Attis would go out into the forest and cut down a pine tree, and then they take it into the town and they place it in the holiest spot in the temple of Cybele. And they dress it up, and they put a little effigy of Attis on it, and they'd wind that with woolen bands, and they'd just decorate it and make it really nice. And then I think it's 2 days after that was the Day of Blood, and they'd have a procession back to the temple, and they'd play really raucous music, and the priests were peculiar because they were all eunuchs. If they were followers of Cybele, they were known to be eunuchs, and they'd wear the Phrygian caps, and they dance wildly, and there'd be a crescendo of dancing and crazed singing and music playing until they'd get into the temple, and they'd all culminate with really violent sort of reenaction of what happened to Attis at the wedding, where his jealous mother, came in, and he killed himself. They cut themselves and they spatter blood all over the tree, and
Jeez.
and and
So it sounds like just a pretty average Christmas then.
yeah, I mean, it's interesting to me that not a lot of people talk about this, though. This information was out, and I haven't seen it anywhere else really, except written well, except in the Golden Bough by Sir James George Fraser. But yeah, the priests of Attis also had a peculiar thing that they did. They all dressed as women. But anyway, my train of thought was sort of waning. Anyway, I want to get back to the new people who wanted to be priests, the initiates. At the time of the crescendo of this crazed dancing and worship of Cybele and Attis, they would castrate themselves and throw their bloody flesh on the tree.
that is an intense Christmas.
But this happened in March, so it was the fall.
Right.
Going on from this, though, I should back up and just talk about what really this all means. Attis died, but Cybele, being remorseful for having caused his death, asked Zeus if he'd resurrect him, and Zeus refused. He just did like a half resurrection, made him into a pine tree which endures through the winter. It always appears to be alive, but it never becomes human again. Adding the blood and the flesh to the tree, though, is what Attis needs to come alive again. It's all about his resurrection, and the question is, well, why do we want this Attis to come back as a human? And the reason for this is because of who he really symbolizes. The Nachash was brought down low by the curse of God when he first met Eve in the garden. And by meeting the woman, or the symbol of humanity to him, he now will have this opportunity, by using her humanness, so to speak, her genetics, or his interaction with her, to eventually become human himself, imitating what God had already done, or at our time has already done.
Oh, wow. That makes a lot of sense with a lot of modern eschatology that or interpretations of things like the mark of the beast and stuff like that. That people say that transhumanism or something like that might have something to do with it, or even a type of return of what happened in Genesis 6 in the end times. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, it's a type of death that the Nachash endured. When they talk about the sleeping god Attis, that's what they're talking about. The people that look at the garden event in the 180 degrees, the illuminated fraternities that look at the garden event, the opposite of how we look at it, of course, say, well, if Satan, if this angel that came there wasn't cursed and somehow restricted from what he really wanted to do, really wanted to help mankind, we would be fine now. Mm-hmm. But this jealous God wrecked everything and cursed the snake and us, and now we need to wait and work through whatever the plan is until our God comes back. And that's sort of what the Attis cult is saying. Well, sort of. It really is what it is saying, but not a lot of people will get that, I think. Anyway, I did say the fall when Attis dies. No, of course it's the spring. The interesting thing is the Romans later on 100 years later or so, changed, stopped following the cult, the specific Phrygian cult of Attis and Cybele, but they kept the god Attis, or the demigod Attis. They changed him into a powerful, more full-fledged god, and called him Sol Invictus, which means invincible sun. And the peculiar thing was, though, even though this was Attis under a different name, this god's birthday was December 25th.
Oh, wow.
So what's going on is Attis is dying in the springtime. When the Earth's coming alive, it's sort of the idea of the garden being present, or becoming present, the beginning of mankind. And you have the Nachash, his incursion into the garden, and his death because of the curse. He waits 9 months, and then you have Sol Invictus, right? You have this idea of the sun god being born at the time. But the initiates know really who we're talking about. We're talking about Attis becoming Sol Invictus and being born again. And
Wow.
it's interesting that it actually was acted out over a century by the Roman religion, starting with Claudius, and then later on they started worshiping Sol Invictus. And Sol Invictus, he's endured for thousands of years under the same name. And the cult of Mithras, which I will talk much more about later, he's very important. But right now, still talking about Sol Invictus, I wanted to mention one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Colossus.
Yeah.
The statue of the Titan Helios, the sun god, was, by another name, Apollo or Attis, and he stood over 98 feet high, and he was put there by the people of the city, because in honor of him, because they thought that he was the one that protected them from the invasion by Antigonus the First, the one-eyed. And I might have mentioned this already, but it was in the southern Doric region, and which means those were the Proto-Greeks that lived in that part of Turkey, or Anatolia, and just above them was the Ionic region. And people who study classical architecture realize that those are classes of that type of architecture, and with the Doric being the most simple form, and Ionic being more complex. Definitely they have their design parameters that they have to be in. They're very, very specific. The other one was Corinthian, but in just to the north of the Colossus was the Temple of Artemis, and that's interesting because, and I haven't talked about Artemis, but she was also known as the mother of Mount Ida, like Cybele was. And
okay.
These two goddesses are very similar in many respects, and the Trojans both worship Cybele and Artemis, and they may not have really had it very much. They distinguish between the two, because over time, goddesses in different cultures are adopted and take on different aspects of the older ones, but she's really the same thing. This sort of leads me to a point that I wanted to make, which is very strange, and it concerns another wonder of the ancient world, the mausoleum of Halicarnassus.
Oh, okay.
And it was said that it was made by the wife of a guy named Mausolus. And Mausolus is interesting because his name means the one, or the one sun. If you look at the etymology of Masolas and Mao, and in ancient Greek, of course, the word came from much older culture, and it's not really known what its origins were, because it was in Anatolia. It could have been attributed to a lot of different cultures, but anyhow, Artemisa, named after Artemis.
When you say sun, you mean sun, S-U-N, right? Not
Yes.
S-O-N.
Yes, the sun. And anyway, Mausolus, he died, and his wife built a huge temple to inter him. And when she died, she was put there too. She was buried in the same temple, and it just started after that to be called, any nice building where the dead were buried was now a mausoleum.
Oh,
But
okay.
the one sun, so it has an allusion to the idea of the sun god. This building does, and interesting feature of the mausoleum of Halicarnassus was, at the very top there was this golden chariot that was pulled by 4 horses, and you had Artemisa and Mausolus in the chariot. But what that was showing was, of course, Attis and Cybele riding in triumph together again. It's an idea of the resurrection of Attis, now back with her mother riding triumphantly. And I don't remember exactly when that temple was destroyed, but my point is, and I am getting to it here slowly, that there's an imitation of this building in Washington, D.C., and it happens to be the headquarters of the Scottish Rite Freemasons.
Oh,
And
wow.
they call it the Supreme Council of the Scottish Rite. And it's located in Washington, D.C., as I said, 16th Street Northwest. And the reason that's kind of curious is I remember seeing a picture of Tom Horn standing in that building. He went there, I think he was invited and shown around by someone. And the room he was staying in was called the Pillars of Charity. And it's a very peculiar room because they have a bust of Albert Pike there.
Oh,
So
wow.
the pillars, and then a sort of a recess, and then a really nice bright, it's not mosaic, but it's like stained glass, and I can't remember what the design was. I think it's probably an all-seeing eye. I'll have to look at it again. But anyway, not only is Albert Pike's bust there, but he's buried there. It is a true mausoleum. And in fact, I think there was a special act of Congress in 1944 where they said it was okay to actually bury someone other than in the graveyard. So the Scottish Rite Freemasons have their patron, I think, buried there. And Albert Pike is known as one of the greatest Masons of all time.
Wow.
Incredibly intelligent guy. The volume and the quality of his writings are really just incredible. He wrote Morals and Dogma.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you're familiar with it, but that is sort of the Bible of Freemasonry. It talks about each level from 1 to 32. And for at least Scottish Rite, you can't work your way up to the 33rd degree. You have to have that given to you by the high-ranking members. But the point being about that is that kind of shows how important the whole idea, the whole understanding, and more than that, the understanding of just what this cult of Attis and Cybele was all about. There's I think people have said there is research out there, and the Freemasons deny it, that they are in any way related to the cult of Mithra, and I say, and I write in the book, that the cult of Cybele and Attis are directly related to the cult of Mithra. I say Mithras. Later, the Greeks call him Mithras, but his name is originally from the Persian Mithra. But he is, if you think of Cybele and Attis, he is an amalgamation of the two. He is Attis in the stage of his rebirth. But I'll go into that a little bit more later on. So the next thing that I wanted to talk about, I think, is going to be probably, if anything's controversial. I'm not saying anything that's really too outlandish in the book, but I think this is different, and I hadn't heard it, I haven't seen it anywhere, and it has something to do with identifying what the importance of the bull or the ox is in mythology.
Yeah. This was one of my favorite parts of the book, and yeah, I know that it's a little controversial just because it's something new, but we have handled much more controversial things on this show than that, so there's no worries there, at least not with this audience. So, yeah, this was one of my favorite parts of the book, and it's really, really interesting.
It's interesting when I first started working with it and thinking that it was really more valid. I didn't really want to believe it, or it's not really, it's not saying it very well. It's I really thought that I would find out later that I was probably going in a wrong direction, or it really didn't make, or wouldn't make sense later on. But as it's turned out, the longer I go, the more it makes sense to me, the more evidence I find to support it. And anyhow, starting out with the concept is, you'll see Zeus a lot, the father of all the ancient gods in Greek and Roman myth, turning himself into a bull very often. He appeared as the Cretan bull and abducted Europa. Later on, as a Cretan bull again, he sired, or the Minotaur, what do you call it? Minos, King Minos's bull. And so that's good. This powerful god, like a bull, the most powerful god would take on some type of aspect of some powerful animal. I guess he could have been a tiger, but he always chooses to be a bull for some reason. Not always, he's been other things, but it's common. His his brother Poseidon, Zeus's brother Poseidon, also manifests as a bull from time to time. But you think, well, the ancient world depended on cattle, and for a lot of different things. So that's another reason why I guess you could say, well, mythology, the bull is very special, and a bull sacrifice is done a lot because it is a valuable animal to the ancients, and that's a valid point too. But you also see a weird theme, sort of it's a triune theme of, this is strange, it's not necessarily bull horns, but it's sometimes interpreted as a crescent moon and a star and a woman together, all like in Egypt, Hathor is displayed, and she's represented by a woman with a half moon or above her head and a star, usually. And if you look at Zeus abducting Europa, you read into the story later on, you'll see that another consort of Europa was Asterion, which means the starry one. And if you look at a lot of stories where there's bulls, you'll see that a woman character, a woman figure, and the bull interacting. And then there's also a star or a serpent. And so the bull is important in that. I mean, I think I've identified what the star is, or perhaps not. The serpent is definitely identified, and the woman's identified, going back to the garden. The star, a lot of the time, is a replacement idea for the Nachash, because he's, of course, the serpent is what he used to be, and he's going to rise and be the bright light, because he symbolizes knowledge. So the brightest star in the sky would be a symbol for him. In our case, in the northern hemisphere, it would be Sirius, but I won't digress to that right now. So as the ancients, or the illuminated, understand, when you see a bull, or you see Zeus as a bull, or you see a bull anywhere in myth, it doesn't necessarily always mean that it's Zeus, even though, you know, that might be the name. Or rather, I think it's better to say that when the ancients are talking about Zeus, they are referring to the one God. And this is controversial. Well, Zeus is the god of the gods of ancient myth. How can you say they're really referring to the one God that created man in the garden?
Right.
And well, you have to look at it in the light of the illuminated today. When they're talking about mythology, that's who they are talking about when they're referring to Zeus. If you look at it that way, it's a little bit easier to accept.
Right. That doesn't mean that like we're accepting it from like that, but it's
right.
just that that's how they would see it.
Right. So the idea is you have to identify the characters in the story before you can understand the story.
Right.
And methods of doing that are looking into the words themselves. I mean, where did the word come from, whatever language it is? I mean, what does the word really mean? Isn't there a Bible written that's called the exposed word version, where each word in Hebrew is translated out instead of left?
Right, yeah.
I can't remember for some reason the name. Anyway, speaking of an ox, in Hebrew, the word for ox is shor, spelled shin vav resh, and it means an ox. But a lot of the time you can look at the word in Hebrew and then look at its root to see, get a little bit more meaning from it. And I don't know if guilty is quite the term, but I'm guilty of doing that a lot, because I'm not going to just stop. Oh, well, it means, oh, what's the root? The root a lot of the time tells you much more. A lot of people, sort of disregard that and say, well, you're stretching. And I don't believe that really at all, especially if you're looking at the word like, anyway, very, very old words describing what's going on in the garden. Definitely look to see what the roots are. But
yeah, absolutely. I'm guilty of that too, so there's no problem. I actually have a Strong's exhaustive concordance right behind me that I use quite often that tells me what root words and everything like that is. So, so you're in good company.
Yeah, Blue Letter Bible, I was on so much that they chose me for they wanted me to critique a new version when it came out.
Oh,
like,
wow,
sorry.
that's awesome.
Online, because we see that you're using it quite often.
I use that quite a bit too. That's usually my go-to thing. If I'm just looking for a verse to copy and paste, I'll just use Bible Gateway. But Blue Letter Bible for my research, that's definitely one that I use quite often.
Yeah, it's so nice and convenient. I wish I had it 10 years ago. Anyway, I don't know when it came out actually, but yeah, it's a great resource. Anyway, the root word for sure is sure, spelled the same way, same letters in Hebrew, but different. I guess you could say inflection marks, but the term for it is nikud, and I believe I'm saying or pronouncing that correctly, but those are I would say, very subtle changes to the way something is written in Hebrew, but you pronounce it differently, and of course the meaning's different. So the root word means to go around or journey. So you have the word for ox, meaning of course ox, but its root meaning to journey or go in a circle. And well, I thought about that for a while. Of course, Taurus, the constellation Taurus, circles every night, goes overhead, and that makes sense to think. Well, I guess there's a big ox in the sky that goes around all the time. Also, in the ancient world and even modern world, they used oxen to thresh grain, and they would be going in a circuit too. And that idea is used a lot. The idea of men being like wheat, having a short time being alive and being fruitful, and then having, being ready for the harvest. A lot of allegory in the idea of wheat and men being threshed, thrown up in the air, and having the chaff blow away, and the good fruit coming down, and what is not needed blows over a fire and explodes, explosively ignites. And then I thought a little bit more about this idea. What is it? What is it about the word? When I say the word, I'm talking about the written word of God, the Old Testament and our New Testament, and I went to its origin, and I think a lot about pi. Not eating it, but about the mathematical constant, and the idea of a circuit. This whole thing started this curse of the Nachash, where he started his I guess you could say limited kingdom on earth was Genesis 3:14, and you'd think, well, now paradise is lost. God left the presence of Eden, and we have this corrupted world with this thing, this Nachash, that went in and started his own way of doing things by getting Eve to become this new creature, with her eyes open. Now she knows evil as well as good, and he's going to be the repository of the knowledge and give it out in whatever way he decides, but there's going to be a certain amount of time that's going to pass, and then he's going to resurrect, bringing his idea of paradise back to earth, removing pillars. So there's this full cycle that has to occur. But of course, at the time of the curse, God also made a prophecy that man would crush his head, even though the serpent would be a problem for him, striking at his heel. And indeed, Christ has died and has risen. There's already a stage that's completely finished. Now we have God back, or we have a path back to Him. So in a stage, as far as us as believers, the pillars have been taken away. There's another stage, of course, that's going to be coming. Christ is going to be returning, and that literally will be when heaven comes back to earth, the final remaining idea of the pillars being removed. But Satan's going to try to counterfeit this, of course, and as much as in a fashion as much as possible, similar to what people expect Christ to do. Christ is going to return. Well, Satan's going to try to imitate that. And
right. Yeah.
So he can fool as many people as possible. But so though I went off on this tangent on the circle idea, the circuit idea, I want to come back to why I thought about that, because the law, the word, is written, and it uses a language, and that language has naturally an alphabet. And where was it first written in a written form and given to man? And that was on Mount Sinai, when God himself, with his own finger, wrote on the tablets the Ten Commandments, gave them to Moses. So what is that alphabet of that language that's holy enough that God would use it?
Yeah.
And so that idea of a very early language was talked about by my brother in his book Temple at the Center of Time. He wrote that Eupolemus in 158 BC wrote that Moses was the first wise man to teach an alphabet to the Jews, who then transferred them the alphabet to the Phoenicians, and then of course Phoenicians transferred it to the Greeks, and that is probably contrary to a lot of what people would, people think that the Phoenician was earlier than Hebrew, but the Phoenician has 22 letters, and it has not a peculiar, but a very straightforward ending letter, the Tav, which means mark, and it's just a cross. I guess you'd say St. Andrew's cross. No, it's
right.
Instead of this, it's this.
Oh, okay.
And looking at it, I think, well, that is a very significant letter. What if this idea came to me? Okay, well, what if you represented an alphabet in a circle, in a circular form, or in the form of a circuit? You'd have to have a beginning and an end, but it's ambiguous. I mean, but in the case of a writing system or alphabet that's holy to the one God, what is the most significant letter? The cross.
Right.
So put the cross at the top, and Phoenician would then be 21 characters. You take out the aleph for the first letter, which happens, the very first letter, I realized, and I don't know at this time if we're going to have an image out, but hopefully I can explain it fairly well and bring the image out with words. As a non-word facile as I am today with this headache. Anyway, the aleph represents the head of a bull. That's what it means, bull head, and it looks like a bull head literally turned on its side. But if you look at it carefully, it could be the combination of two tavs connected, sort of in this fashion, if this two X's like this
Right.
together. There's just a slight overlap of one portion of the letter. In that case, you could have either the tav, or the cross, or the bull's head as a representation that now the alphabet's connected at the top, where the tav is at the head, and to designate that it is connected there, we're going to actually write both the tavs together and combine them, and that makes something that looks like a bull's head. And later on, you take that combination apart and you leave the aleph alone. It's now a new letter, and you take the tav apart and you make it an alphabet as we understand them, written from one end to the other. Now it's not eternal in that sense that there's no beginning or an end to it. And of course, man takes it and corrupts it. Maybe it was a bit complicated to always write an alphabet in a circular fashion. but that idea is where the image of the bull's head comes. So the idea that God himself is going to come down to this earth and become a man, that legend before it actually occurred was in the mind of all the creatures that inhabited his creation. It was a big deal. And God himself definitely would have a language that was holy, a perfect writing system. And he used it, and he gave his law to men, gave it to Moses, gave it to the Israelites. And the letter at the head, now that there's an extra letter after the combination of at the head of the Aleph of the two Tavs, has 22 letters. Of course, so Phoenician has 22 letters, not 21, and modern Hebrew has 22, I'd say, base letters. There's extensions of the same letter. I'm definitely not a language expert, and I don't want to go there because there's enough to think about rather than getting into, going back to the point of writing the book, I really don't need to become an expert. I mean, in anything really extensively, because I have that information at my fingertips.
Absolutely.
I can go online and I can see these things. I can look them up, and if I need more information, I can go out and ask the experts, and I'm sure they'll point me in the right direction. But that Aleph and Tav idea being connected, I think, is what led to the idea of the bull representing the one God, because his language, his circular representation of a language, of the alphabet that he used to give his law, give his writings, and there's something magical about writing, is because it endures, where you can have truth in it, and it can be eternal as far as man is concerned. It can exist as long as men honestly reproduce it or keep it intact. That image of a circular writing system is also a symbol for God. And the Aleph at the top, where the Tavs are connected, where the Tav is just one, I'm not saying there's two of them, there was originally just one.
Right.
That idea is a representation of God. So that combination of the Tavs becoming the Aleph, which looks like a head of a bull, now the bull in turn is becoming a symbol for God. So
that makes sense. Yeah.
It's interesting too if you look at what the Masons do with their square and compass. I know they say, well, they're the tools of being a Mason. You need to be able to make circles perfectly. So you use the compass and the square. Everything needs to be very precise to be making buildings that have integrity, like the Freemasons have integrity, like they say they have integrity. But you'll often see the compass and the square with two hands holding each other in between. And if it's drawn this way, it really accentuates the idea of the Tavs being joined. And I think the upper echelons of Freemasonic or illuminated fraternities understand this concept of the bullhead, the Aleph, and the writing system. And in fact, one of the Egyptian gods, the very important Egyptian gods, was Thoth, and his animal symbol or his animal manifestation was Attis, which you'd see on the shores of the Nile eating, but they look as if they're writing in the mud. From Thoth, you have Mercury, the Roman Mercury, and before him you have Hermes. These are all the same god: Thoth, Hermes, and Mercury.
In your research with everything that you've come across with this idea of the bull. Have you found any connections with that with like the first chapter of Ezekiel or in Revelation, where it talks about the cherubim and how one of them actually has the head of an ox? Has that come up? Is there any correlation between those two, do you think?
I've considered that. My brother talked about the constellations and that sort of mirror in the way that the cherubim appear, the brightest stars in each, the bright constellation has a brightest star. I think, let's see, it'd be Taurus. I'm trying to think of the stars in Taurus right now, but I'm drawing a blank, lamely. Oh, Aldebaran. And that idea of the heavens being surrounded the earth and the angels mirroring somehow God's creation in their appearance. But I have looked at the Old Testament, a very old book in the Old Testament, the book of Job, and found something that I thought was not, I don't know if the word peculiar is a good word to describe it, but that stood out to me in relating this idea of this ox, this idea of the ox at the head of the circuit, this idea of being the symbol for God. I think it's in Job 40 where God's describing his power and using the beast known as Behemoth, and talking about how it eats grass. And that word, if you look at it, Behemoth, from the word Behemah, actually means a wild beast, but it also can mean cattle.
Oh, wow.
And God's talking about his power, you know. And interestingly, I mean, you have this idea, this image of an incredibly powerful beast of the field, ox-like, and then immediately the next thing that God's talking about is Leviathan. And Leviathan also has another meaning, which alludes to that idea of this circuit again, with the ox at the top. Leva, or Leviathan, is the sea monster, but it comes from the word leva, which means to be joined. And my brother Dave talked about Leviathan, and very extensively in Cydonia, the Secret Chronicles of Mars. And the Ouroboros, the snake, with its tail in its mouth.
Right. Yeah.
And its relation to the cycle of the aeons. And I definitely won't go off on that direction because it's already been well explained. But I will relate a pleasant story I have. Once we were going to Roswell, I can't remember what year it was, but we were driving somewhere around before Las Cruces, and it was dark. We went off on some rest stop, and there was no lights at all. For some reason, this rest stop had no lighting, and it was a perfectly clear night, and you could see the Milky Way, and Scorpius was south, and you could see Antares. But the thing that was really incredible to me, I'd never ever noticed this, but Dave pointed out, if you look at on a really dark night, you can actually see an outline of the snake with its tail in its mouth, and you can
Oh, wow.
You can see the eye of the snake. It must have been obvious to the people who lived, without the electric light polluting our night skies all the time. Everybody would have known, well, yeah, there's a big, huge monster out there with its tail in its mouth, made out of stars. And of course, my brother is one that pointed that out to me on a very dark night on his way to Roswell. I didn't believe it, I thought, well, it's just sort of how you can look at a constellation and say, well, that kind of looks like a bull or whatever, but I mean, this looks like a snake. with his
Wow,
children.
that's amazing.
So, getting back to talking about the Book of Job, I just thought it was interesting that first God would talk about the bull or behemoth, and then immediately, explain the story or describe his power again using the idea of the Leviathan.
Yeah, yeah,
And,
absolutely. Wow,
and
that's something I must have read over 100 times at least, and I've never
Mhm.
thought about it like that. That's amazing.
um, I have a colleague I talk to about this a lot, and he was very slow to accept the concept, but now I think I've made him a believer. Maybe.
That's always good.
Anyway, the word, I mean, Rosh Hashanah occurred what? I mean, the first night of it was last night. It's the 26th now, so it was, yeah. So the word Rosh means head, or the head of the year, but the reason I'm talking about Rosh is the head. At the head of the circuit is the cross, and if you think of what Christ did, completing the circuit of what happened, or the tragedy that happened in the Garden of Eden, man fell, God left. The path for man to God was very difficult, right? God reached down and gave the Israelites his law, took them out of Egypt, out of slavery, and led them into the land he promised to them. And from them being there in the land, there was a place where they could build finally the temple, and then the Messiah could come and then do what was prophesied in Genesis. And Christ came and did that. And at the resurrection, now you have a completion of the circuit. It's sort of a circuit within a circuit. The first set, you have now man's with God, and Nachash comes to the garden and convinces Eve to do what God told her not to. God leaves paradise. You have the separation of heaven and earth. And you have, more importantly, an impediment now set in place where man has no communion with God anymore. He needs to go through now the temple priests. As you came back into the temple that was built in Jerusalem, it was surrounded by ceremony, sacrifice of animals, and you had the high priest only one time a year actually going into the holiest place to talk to God or have God talk to him. And after Christ's resurrection, the separating portion of the temple, the holy place where you looked in, was now torn in half. Now we can directly have a relationship with God through his Son. So that is a completion of the circuit. So if you go to Golgotha, the place of the skull, or the place of at the head, you physically have an image of God at the cross, at the very
Wow.
top. He's at the cross. So you have the idea of God's holiness, but that same image, that same circular idea, or that connecting at the top where the cross is now where Christ finished or completed the circuit. And that is the main reason why I think that concept of the letter circuit is quite valid. And
Yeah, absolutely.
the more I look at what the illuminated fraternities are playing at, especially with modern media, sort of the hidden in plain sight games that they play, which they love, I'm seeing that they most likely understand this concept as well. So,
Wow, isn't that fascinating that they get something that isn't taught in the modern church.
Yeah, I'm excited about getting this idea out, and I expect a lot of people to dismiss it as just, something that's pretty, I don't know. It's not crazy at all. I think it's very well. I think it is an actual area to go to, and that hasn't been examined before. And I think if you look at mythology and a lot of the sort of the ritual that the Freemasons do, I think you'll start seeing this more and more. Even in the architecture, in classical architecture, there's a thing called bucranium. Just means bull skull, and you'll see in the temples you'll have a bull skull and then a rose. That idea of the head, a roche, or a play on words that they love to do, and then another bull skull, and then a roche again, and that has its own term for the way it's decorated on these temples. And also in mythology and a lot of Gnosticism, you'll see rituals that are done that add to the validity of this idea of this circuit, this bull circuit idea. And I'll probably call it from now either ox circuit or bull circuit interchangeably. But there's this thing that the ancients did with bees, or the belief they had about the generation of bees. And it was called begonia. And unfortunately, I realized that the word begonia was spelled incorrectly in the book. It's the flower begonia, B-E-G-O-N-I-A. It should be B-U-G-O-N-I-A, begonia, and that is the belief in the spontaneous generation of bees, but not just the spontaneous generation of bees, but specifically generating bees by killing oxen.
Right, yeah.
I hadn't heard about this until maybe 2 years ago, and when I stumbled upon it, I thought it's probably one of the strangest things I've ever researched. And
yeah, that's what I found. So, yeah, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I was just gonna quickly.
Oh no, go ahead.
I was just gonna quickly say that's what I found so fascinating about that chapter specifically. Is that something I've looked into Greek mythology and lots of different mythology. I've never heard of this, and so that was definitely interesting. But yeah, sorry to cut you off. I just.
Oh no, I definitely encourage you, as much as you'd like to cut me off, not cut me off, just interact with me. Beekeeping was an important part of ancient civilization, and the gods had the attribute of being expert beekeepers. I think Apollo's son was his name. Aristeus was an expert beekeeper. And the Neoplatonists believe that souls, or the many, descended into incarnation on earth. And after death, they ascended back into heaven, where they became one with an intelligence.
Right.
I won't get into Gnosticism because that would really lead somewhere very far away from where it's related, but I won't go too far. But the begonia idea, well, I'll just explain like one method of begonia. What they would do is they would bury an ox up to its horns and let it die, and they leave it there a specific amount of time, so like 3 weeks, let it rot in the soil, and then they come up with an axe. And another peculiarity is they'd use a double-bladed axe.
Oh, wow.
And they'd strike the bull with a part where his horns are emerging, in the head, and it was said that the bees would emerge. That's strange, but a stranger account, and this is a bit, I don't know, it leads into the idea of this sort of angelic control or angelic desire or to control the lives of men or the destiny of men. And of course, the Nachash is angelic, but there is a Roman philosopher, Pliny the Elder. He had a set of instructions about how to generate bees, and what they do is they'd build a specifically sized building for this cube. It would be equal height and width, and they'd go inside with an ox and they'd beat the animal to death with clubs, breaking as many bones as they could, being careful not to break the skin. And then they'd cover all the holes of this the bowl up with pitch. They'd make sure there's no open areas. They'd damage the skin, and coat it with clay, and then they'd seal the whole house in the same manner with clay and pitch, and they'd leave it there for 3 weeks, and they'd come back, and they wouldn't enter it right away, but they'd open the downwind side of the place and let light in. And later on, I think they'd wait another 11 days. They'd go into the building, and they would expect to find it just infested with bees. Just they'd be full of bees. I think it's written that they'd be hanging together in clusters.
Oh, wow.
And the ox would be completely consumed. There'd be nothing left but hair and bones, and of course its horns. The interesting thing I thought about that is the 3 weeks, or 21 days plus 11 is 32, and that has all the hallmarks of the signature of this 32 or 33 idea, the idea of a third. The Masons are absolutely fixated on it, and the simplest explanation I can give is the same that my brother used to give, and that is just a third of the angels. It's,
right.
That identity, the third that went with the Nachash. But that is extremely peculiar. But the reason I bring all this up about begonia is, I mean, the question is, why would they do something like that? Why first of all, would it take beating a bull to death very violently and to create bees, you know? And if you consider that the ancients considered the bull as a symbol for God himself, and they were allied with the Nachash, well, then the bull is hated. The bull needs to be violently or killed with prejudice. And only after it's killed this way will then the souls that this jealous God keeps in prison be released.
Right.
I don't think anybody explains begonia in that fashion. It's sort of a curiosity. They say that the Neoplatonists used to practice, and I have not been able to find a lot of literature about it, but this is the idea behind it, that the god's their enemy. And you'll find in mythology a lot of the time that bulls are sacrificed. I mean, that's not so strange, but this idea of beating a bull to death and having bees generate spontaneously from its carcass is definitely interesting in the light of what the reversed understanding of the garden is, and
Right.
the idea that through the idea of the ox circuit, that symbolic way an alphabet is represented, that's holy to God himself, that gives you the idea of the hatred for the bull, well, that's the one God. That's the one God that imprisoned mankind in the garden. Would have left them there unless the Nachash had come to free us. So
It makes a lot of sense too with what you were talking about, how they would split the bull's head at the horns, because that's almost like breaking that circuit right at the
right,
hole, like
yeah,
you were saying.
absolutely. And I hadn't considered that, but that makes a lot of sense. So I guess it's a good segue into the cult of Mithra.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is a extremely big deal when it comes to the Masons, and I think I might have mentioned this before. The Masons will never ever say that they have anything to do with the cult of Mithra. They'll say their ceremonies have nothing to do with that, and I can prove that is complete obfuscation.
Right.
The Masons, though, again, I do and I don't want to say this, but I don't wish to offend anybody, and I know I will offend Masons that are listening, because I talk as if I have such authority to, well, he can't say that, he's not a Mason, and ultimate insult to someone who is a Mason, who's worked a long time and gone up, to as many degrees as they have. But say, I understand what the craft is. I understand what the Brotherhood's all about, and the knowledge that they're teaching, and it isn't what you're saying.
Right.
And to that I say, well, then you're naive, and no
There
one
you
wants
go.
to hear that. Continue with the idea of the cult of Mithras. The word. Well, I won't start with the word Mithra, but I will say there is a symbol of the cult, and it was a naked lion-headed man. I think the term for it is lientocephaline, and this is a very peculiar looking sort of statue. It's supposed to be a representation of Mithras, and I say Mithras. It sounds better to me instead of Mithra, but it's the Greek way of saying the god's name. But this lion man usually is shown standing on the earth with a tav, and he's wrapped by a snake all the way up past his waist, and he has a peculiar sort of winged back. He has 4 wings, just like a cherubim has, or is said to have in Ezekiel's vision.
Wow, that's steeped with imagery.
Yeah, so this thing is, I didn't talk about the idea of what the lion really represents, but it really is as angelic as any images that the ancients had for their gods. Especially the 4 wings is very, very interesting.
Yeah.
Sort of digress here. There's that city in Iraq called Nineveh.
Uh-huh.
Same city that Jonah went to preach, said that they need to repent. And of course, I was talking to you about Jonah a little bit earlier, and I wrote a little bit about Jonah in the book. But there was an artifact found in Nineveh, I think back, the early 1900s, and it was an angelic figure it had 4 wings, and I think it was in a sitting position, and it was in that weird sort of characteristic Baphomet position of having one arm up and one arm down.
Right.
And its face too looked sort of vaguely lion-like. And the archaeologists said that this was the Babylonian god named Pazuzu, the god of wind. But it looks a lot like the modern representation of the Baphomet, or the description of it. And I'll get back to it, but it also reminds me of this because it has the four wings. It looks like the representation of this statue that the cult Mithras used.
Oh, wow.
It came from Nineveh, and it also was used as this background image in The Exorcist, if you remember, if you've ever seen that movie. When Max von Sydow went there, or was it von Sydow that was the archaeologist / priest guy? But anyway, that statue of Pazuzu that they actually excavated from Nineveh was in the movie.
Oh, wow.
Which is quite chilling.
Yeah, no kidding.
It's chilling to me because of research I've done on the Baphomet and what that is all about. And, you know, it's probably, I don't know how, I think if I feel like going off on tangents, it's good because I probably wouldn't have remembered that, you know, so.
Well, like I said in the first part, if this show wasn't called The Sharpening, it'd be called The Tangent. So it's a common theme in just about every episode. That,
yes, and our next frenetic guest is Mark Flynn.
Yeah, absolutely.
He also takes us from saying nothing badly to pressured speech, going on tangents.
Oh, you're doing fine, but yeah, the Baphomet thing, that's another thing that's just steeped in symbolism too.
Yeah, it's that idea of throwing images out all the time in plain sight. The Illuminated love that because it's hermetic, and I think that's one of the last things I'll talk about in this series is hermeticism.
Okay.
And I have a lot to say about that. I think it's a good thing to kind of wrap up. But talking about Mithras at this point is very good because it's so steeped in what the Masons are doing right now. And in fact, the illuminated elite that control the banking systems in this country and the government of this country are absolutely hermetic in how they operate. Hermes is the way. He shows the way of how to act. And I will stop talking about Hermes right now, but I will definitely get into him later. But you can only understand Hermes really well if you first understand the cult of Mithras and who Mithras was. And so from going on to talking about the lion-headed symbol for the cult or Mithras himself, should talk about the history of the cult. It's one of the oldest religions, it is said to be, and it came out of Anatolia to via probably Babylon, Persia, and Mithra was worshipped openly all the way till later in Roman history, actually until Christianity overshadowed the practice of the cult, and the Roman soldiers were definitely into the cult. And even to this day, you can find the caves or the Mithraeum that they used to have their services or their rituals in. And a lot of them, I mean, you'll find them up from Great Britain all the way to Egypt, all over the Mediterranean, Greece, Rome. Of course, Anatolia, you'll find the Mithraeum, and they're either natural or man-made caves, very characteristic sort of arched entranceways, and they have a specific requirement that they be built by flowing water.
Oh, okay.
And that's important to remember. But a lot of the time, if they're newer, you'll find an altar in the center of the cave, this area, and sometimes you'll find a statue of Mithras there. And what he'll be doing is he'll be in the act of slaughtering a bull, and he does it in a specific position. And the art of the cult is very peculiar. One that you'll see a lot is called a tauroctony, which means bull murder. And in the image, you'll see Mithras, astride a bull with a sword going through its chest, in front of its chest, and he'll be holding the bull with his, I believe it's his left hand by the nose, and he'll be looking over his right shoulder towards Sol Invictus, or it's said to be Sol Invictus. And if you're looking at this thing called the tauroctony, you'll see, and it's not talked about a lot in the description, only Sol Invictus is, and there'll always be a line or something drawn between Mithras looking at Sol Invictus, a comet going toward it or something. But to Mithras' left, there'll be this woman somehow emerging from rock with this crescent moon above her head. Emerging from the rock. It reminds me of a specific deity from Anatolia. And below him, there'll be a serpent and a scorpion and a dog. And a lot of people talk about the relationship that has with the constellations, but I don't go into that at all. I talk about the meaning behind what you're seeing there in that depiction of Mithras killing the bull. And if you buy the idea that the bull is symbolizing the one God, it is really a diabolical sort of chilling image, because what you have there is you have Cybele, or Eve, on one side emerging from the rock as symbol, as a symbol of Cybele. She's always said to be emerging continually from rock. She's not fully expressed herself yet. And then you have Sol Invictus. It's also emerging from the rock. He is somehow restrained as well, but Mithras looks almost exactly like Sol Invictus.
Oh, wow.
Has the halo of light around his head. He wears a Phrygian cap. He is on top of this bull, killing it, murdering a bull. And that is an expression of the triumph of Attis finally being resurrected and conquering God. It also is interesting to realize that Mithras' birthday is the same as Sol Invictus. It's the 25th of December.
Oh, wow.
So anyway, going back, the Mithraeum that I was talking about with the running water are important. And in Washington, D.C., there happens to be a Mithraeum that they built, and there's what you'd expect there, running water, and it looks very much like what you'd find in Rome, and it's at a lower level. I don't recall the name of the person that made it. Originally, I think there was going to be two of them, but just being the kind of person I am, I went on Google Earth and I measured the distance between the western entrance of the Capitol building and this area, and it's 666 feet away.
Oh, wow.
but the name of the area is called a grotto. They call it the grotto, and it's for tourists or people just to rest after they're wandering around the Capitol area. And the word grotto comes from the Italian grotta, which just means crypt. And,
wow.
that idea, so you have Mithras wearing the Phrygian cap, that Deshret red cap, that bee proboscis cap that Neth wore from the Bright Lands. Eventually, they're wanting to reconnect to the Dark Lands or the Earth Lands controlled by Set. You have the allegory of Mithras, the bee god, the sun god, finally coming to Earth, finally through his unification with his mother, being manifest as Mithras. and as Mithras, a final triumph over the god that cursed him. That's sort of, it took a long time to get to this point where I'm actually talking about what that Tarakhtani scene represents, and I've looked a lot at the information out there about, maybe someone has a better idea about the cult of Mithras, but it's ritual, the meaning of the rituals. Mostly everybody who does any study on this says that they've been lost. At the time that it was a very popular cult, the meaning of the rituals were closely guarded. It was just like the Masons do today. They're, if you go into the Brotherhood, some of the first things you'll hear are the warnings, the punishments that will be given to anyone who joins and then divulges any of the secrets. So anyway, I have an interesting story that I can remember now about my brother. I guess must have been around 2005 or something. Richard Hoagland invited him to a conference he was doing, and this is when Hoagland was talking about the photographic material that he had found from the Apollo missions.
Oh, right, yeah.
Anomalies on the moon. And so he invited Dave to do a lecture there. And so Dave, I think, did, or he attended. Yeah, no, he did. And he was talking about Masonic symbolism. He's explaining a lot of the things that were going on with the compass rose and things like that. And it turns out that one of the ex-military people, and I won't put any names out, that was responsible for going over all the raw photo information that was coming back from the Apollo missions before the public could see it, was a high-level Mason. And
oh, wow.
So after, but Dave didn't know this. I mean, he's a nice enough guy. Came up to Dave, but at that point, he didn't really appear very nice. He was kind of menacing. He was, he said to Dave, well, of course, what the penalties are for divulging, explaining information that is supposed to be secret, And Dave said, oh yeah, of course. And then he actually quotes, the punishment, being buried
Oh, geez.
up to your neck, at, low tide, and having your tongue cut out and disembowelment, all the stuff that they talk about. Yeah, but I'm not a Mason. And this individual sort of, stepped back. Said, oh, I didn't say anything. Went up to his hotel room, and he came back down wearing one of those bolo ties with a nice compass, a big, huge silver compass and square on it, and was fine. After that, invited him over to his house and everything.
Oh,
They thought that
wow.
was interesting.
Yeah,
and I always thought that was interesting.
Yeah, that's pretty telling
And I
right
thought
there.
about, but the idea of the big change in his attitude towards him was that anybody that is a Mason and really is higher up and understands the illuminated secrets understands where the information comes from, and it comes from the god Hermes himself. And Hermes is the one that opens men's eyes or closes them. And who is he to say who Hermes should touch or not touch, right?
Right.
His mind had blessed this man with knowledge. Then a friend of Hermes is a friend of his. Anyway. So anyway, oh yeah, so the guy that built the grotto's name was Olmsted, and I think it was built in like 1874. But that's all I have to say about the area of Washington, D.C. for now. I'll probably talk about it a lot more. But connecting specifically the Freemasons to the cult of Mithras. Have you ever seen and this is all over the internet, images scanned from the Freemasons monitor from the late 1800s and early 1900s. There's a depiction, and I have it in the book, the all-seeing eye.
Yeah.
Below it, as you're looking at to the left, is the sun, and then there's a comet going towards the sun, and then there's some stars next to the comet, and then to the right there's this crescent moon, and it happens to coincide if you lay it over the top of the Tauroctony, you have the moon right over where Cybele is emerging from the rock, and you have the sun right where Sol Invictus happens to be, and the comet, that line going towards the sun, is exactly where Mithras is looking at Sol Invictus.
Oh, wow.
With the starry background, that asterion idea, the starry one, you'll see that a lot. That starry idea that the Nachash is related to knowledge. These stars, the one that has it is the one with stars, or the starry one. Underneath that image, you'll see the typically sort of obfuscated Masonic explanation of what they're showing you. It never, of course, is very near the truth, or if there is a little bit of truth in it, you can see the person who's writing it is feeling very clever. Oh, I'm concealing this well, you know.
Right.
But, it says, the all-seeing eye, whom the sun and moon and stars obey, and under whose watchful care even the comets perform their stupendous revolutions, pervades the inmost recesses of the human heart, and will reward us according to our merits. That's interesting, because there's nothing about the cult of Mithras there, or the identity of the entity that they're worshiping, or they're worshiping and hoping to get knowledge from, that would end in eventual eternal life for them. And that's another thing that I don't think any Freemason would tell you. I mean, what's the ultimate goal of you being a Freemason? And I don't know what they'd tell me, but I don't think it would be eternal life.
Right.
But the Christian would say that to you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right away. Ultimately, I mean, a relationship with God, and of course, eternal life naturally follows from that. The Freemason would say, a high-level one would say, well, through the knowledge that I'm going to get, that I am getting because I understand, and because Hermes will bless me, or the Nachash, aka Hermes, will bless me, I will get eternal life. Eventually, maybe not just yet, but if my brothers are successful. And it all comes down to what their ultimate purpose is, and I'll get to that probably a little bit later too.
Good deal. Wow, that's fascinating.
I'm talking about the cult of Mithra and the very important aspects it has with modern Freemasons. And like I said before, that they will of course deny. It's not something that people haven't talked about before, but it's not really common that they do. So I wrote this book over. It's taken about 8 months for it to come out, and I started a long time ago. I probably started a year after my brother passed away. So I've been, up to this point, I hadn't heard anything about this this interesting movie that came out in 2012, and it was by some Canadian people. I don't know their name, but the name of the movie was The Conspiracy, and I found it on Netflix the other day, and about halfway through, I thought it was pretty interesting. I think it was an independent movie, but anyway, the movie started, changing and getting very strange right around the middle, and it started to bring the cult of Mithra into the movie. And
Oh, wow.
I won't try to spoil the movie at all, but I encourage people to, if they get a chance, I think I found it on Netflix, to go out and watch it, because they get some things right about the cult. the word that they use isn't quite correct. It actually means, it's actually a Latin term for the foot, parts of the ankle. I mean, you have Taurus or Taurus, and you have Tarsus.
Oh, okay.
They sound close, but it was just too weird. There's no such thing as coincidence, but the weirdness of this movie being out and coming out right around the time that my book is coming out is very strange. And people, I thought, would look at the movie and think, well, maybe got some ideas. Then I thought, well, no, that's just one aspect of the book that's important. But I think the fact that the movie's out and the subject that it covers is interesting enough that I'd mention it. Maybe so it appears. Because I didn't write about a lot of the things that I'm talking about now in the book, just because I discovered them later, or I didn't think it was something that should be in really make any sense to put in the book. But I guess that's what talking to people is for. You can be free to say whatever, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm gonna have to check that movie out. But yeah, definitely. There are things that I've talked about on radio shows about my book, Quantum Creation, that's not really a huge point in the book, but it just comes out in talking. So yeah, that happens.
Yeah, that's something that's really good about talking or being interviewed. I think I wouldn't think of it unless I was talking to you, Josh.
Ah, well, I bring that out in people, I guess.
So, where am I here? So yeah, thinking about the cult of Mithras, I thought, wow, the bullfight has more meaning than I originally expected.
Right, yeah.
You have a brightly dressed, skillful, athletic person in the ring. Oh, the lights are. Did you see that? Going
Yeah.
Anyway, and he's antagonizing the bull. He's humiliating the bull. He's turning his back to it. He's he getting in its way and avoiding it, disregarding its danger to him. And then he takes his barbed wands and he sticks it in the back, tortures the bull for a while. And if he's a successful matador, and he kills the bull with a sword like Mithras did with one stroke, only when he decides to do it. And interesting, Spanish matador is he's a dancer, and he wears a suit of lights. So that idea again too, that Mithras is the sun or the bright one. I don't think people, especially the United States, know about the name of the suit he wears, but that's sort of an allusion to the idea that he's related to that bull killing cult figure, Mithras. And
Yeah, you also had a really interesting, I don't know if I'm jumping ahead, but you also had a really interesting comparison with Gilgamesh and Enkidu.
Yeah, the first, I guess a lot of people have realized that it's the first bullfight, but there again, the bull of heaven is part of one of the characters there, and the bull ends up dead, and I think it's who is it? Ishtar is
Right.
the one that's
Yeah.
the whole thing, and that story isn't as fresh in my head as it should be, but yeah, that is one of the first bullfights, and Gilgamesh was successful in dispatching it.
It absolutely is fascinating. Unfortunately, it's looking like we're just about all out of time for this part two. But before we conclude, I do want to ask again, and I'll probably do this for every part, if people are interested in finding more about you or your work, where can they go?
They can go to my website, markaflynn.com. They can also go to Watcher Vault. And in fact, they could even go to just Watcher, the original Watcher website. I talked to Brenda last night, and she said she'd added a link to my book there. And my book, of course, can be found on Tom Horn's site, Raiders News Update, and purchased from his site. I think it's also Survivor Mall, but there's a link both on my site and elsewhere, and you can find the book also on Amazon.
Fantastic.
As well.
Oh, good deal. That's awesome. What is the original Watcher site? Is it last time I checked, it had a really weird weird
and
address.
It has always been that. It's mt.net, and then the old-fashioned tilde and a / and then the word Watcher. But I wouldn't even attempt to try to type that out. Just look at it in Google, and it should be one of the first sites to come up. Watcher website.
Awesome, good deal.
And, I believe it's linked on markaflynn.com in my links. So.
Oh, perfect. Okay. Well, there you go. Then it sounds like the easiest way is Mark A. Flynn or Watcher Vault. Those are both pretty easy to remember.
Circular way. Eventually, you'll find it. The source of all the Watcher sites. Brenda says since 1994, but actually I think it's started in 95.
Wow.
If she hears me say that online. Oh no, gotta tell. She corrected me before on that. She says it's 94. It's been out since 94. So anyway, yeah, that's where you can find it. All right. Yeah,
awesome,
yeah.
Awesome.
And I do have a blog that's listed on that you can find on the markaflynn.com, and it's called The Revealing. So you click on that, you'll go to a WordPress blog that I will be posting a lot more information there in the future.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I've read. I think I've read everything that you have on there by now, and for those viewing this episode or listening to it, you won't be disappointed. There's a lot of really great information in Mark's blog, so you definitely got to check that out. All right. Well, I do believe that is the end of this part. This is part 2. So part 2 with Mark Flynn, of course, author of Forbidden Secrets of the Labyrinth. And again, you can pick that up at the links that Mark has provided. Again, a special thanks goes out to Mark for being on the show and agreeing to do this series and for helping so much with the series. So all that being said, tune in next week. We will have part 3. If you're watching the video, it'll probably be out sooner than a week. But if you're listening on Blog Talk Radio, it will be out the week following the time you're listening to this now. So all that being said, you have been listening to The Sharpening, and I am your host, Josh Peck. And as always, take care and God bless.